Hello, I'm Sarah Parker, Chief Justice of North Carolina. Thank you for taking the time to watch this Lawyer Assistance Program CLE video. The legal profession is a collegial profession. As a lawyer, you fight out issues in an adversarial system for your clients. But as members of the profession, we should look after the well-being of each other. Please take to heart the information in this CLE video so that you will be better prepared to reach out to members of the profession needing assistance by calling the Lawyer Assistance Program and asking it to provide confidential help for another lawyer. The stronger the bonds of the profession, the better we are able to serve the public. Thanks again for your attention to this video. My hope is that it will provide useful information about a valuable resource available to you in dealing with this important subject.
Hello, I'm Mark Merritt. I'm an attorney in Charlotte, North Carolina that practices with the law firm of Robinson, Bradshaw, and Henson. I'm a bar counselor from the 26th District, and I currently serve as chairman of the Lawyers Assistance Program. For 30 years, the Lawyers Assistance Program has helped lawyers in North Carolina deal with issues related to drug addiction, mental illness, and other impairments. Throughout its 30-year history, the Lawyers Assistance Program has enjoyed the support of the leadership of the bar. The leadership of the bar has recognized that as a self-governing profession, that it is important to have a program in place like the Lawyers Assistance Program to assist impaired lawyers on their road to recovery. We have 3 members on our staff who are professionals that have worked with attorneys for a number of years and are available throughout the state to help lawyers get into the appropriate treatment program and recovery programs to meet their individual circumstances. The second part of the Lawyers Assistance Program is our over 200 volunteers who are again located throughout the state. These volunteers are trained to help fellow lawyers deal with issues related to mental illness and drug addiction, and many of them are in recovery and have dealt with these issues on a personal basis. We believe that this combination of a trained professional staff along with our 200 trained volunteers is a highly effective combination to help lawyers deal with the issues that they face with respect to drug addiction and mental illness. I can tell you as chair for the last 2 years that hundreds of lawyers in North Carolina have been helped by our program and have been put on the road to recovery. A second part of what we do in the Lawyers Assistance Program is educational. We provide information on issues related to drug addiction and mental illness through lawyers throughout the state in various publications and in various continuing legal education programs, which is why we're here today. Our first presenter will be Dr. Al Mooney. Dr. Mooney is a member of the Lawyers Assistance Program Board and has extensive experience in helping lawyers deal with issues related to drug addiction and mental illness. Dr. Mooney will begin by talking about some science-based protocols that have proven to be helpful in identifying people who may be at risk for alcoholism. This segment of the program will not focus on how to treat alcoholics, but on the characteristics that might predispose someone to alcoholism and how to prevent alcoholism. It is much like your internist telling you what steps to take in order to avoid getting heart disease. Dr. Mooney will then discuss the issues of anxiety and depression. We found in a recent survey that about 11% of all lawyers in North Carolina are being treated for anxiety, and about 12% of all attorneys in North Carolina are being treated for depression. What Dr. Mooney will do is discuss the medications that are being used to treat these illnesses and how they affect the performance of lawyers, specifically how they affect the executive function of lawyers and how they may affect their ability to practice law. Following Dr. Mooney, Dr. Omar Menajawala is going to discuss issues of depression and alcoholism. These two conditions are often together and affect lawyers in ways that are different than each of those conditions individually. He's going to discuss some of the latest information about people who suffer from both depression and alcoholism, and we believe it'll be very informative. Finally, throughout the CLE presentation today, you will see clips from attorneys who themselves at various times have dealt with issues related to drug addiction and mental illness. We have found that the best educators of fellow lawyers around issues related to mental illness and drug addiction are the lawyers who have themselves successfully dealt with those issues. We think that you'll find their stories to be both informative and indeed inspirational. I want to close by thanking each of you for being here today for this continuing legal education program. The unfortunate reality is that drug addiction and mental illness affect a very high percentage of lawyers in North Carolina. We're hopeful that the information that we're presenting today will be useful to you in your personal life or will help you assist a colleague who may be in need because he or she faces one of these conditions. We want you to know that the Lawyers Assistance Program is here for you, that it's a confidential program, and that it's only a phone call away. Thank you very much.
Thanks for asking me to talk a little bit about at-risk drinking. Because in a society like ours that does use alcohol, or a number of people do, it's worthwhile to think in terms of how we can help those people, the minority of people, though, that have problems with alcohol. And there's some techniques that are emerging in a way that actually makes that fairly straightforward. A lot of us might think that everybody in America drinks, and that's really not true. Drinking is socially acceptable, but so is not drinking. It's always important for people to remember that not drinking and abstinence is socially acceptable. There are a lot of people in recovery. There are a lot of people who have other issues related to medicine, personal desires, religious preferences, pregnancy. There are plenty of times where people choose not to drink, and I think the first thing we can do to help is to make sure that people know that not drinking is completely socially acceptable. But there are people who do drink, and some of those people, as we know, it doesn't take going very far. You read the papers, look at hospitalization rates and some of the things that we in medicine are aware of, and you see that alcohol is a huge problem. I call it alcoholism, alcohol problems. I call it our number one health problem in America, and that also applies to North Carolina. But everyone who drinks does not have a problem with it. There's some things that we're learning now that will allow us to focus on a subset of people who drink at all. And we're not talking about, again, people with problems, but there are ways to help people determine, are they at risk? And the qualifications, the standards we use for determining at-risk drinking have really nothing to do with how it affects that person's life. These is a statistical methodology that we've found very helpful in looking at risk. And by risk, I mean the same way we would look at a mole. Before a doctor takes a mole off of your skin, he doesn't need to know if that's melanoma. As a matter of fact, you don't want him to wait until it turns into melanoma to take it off. It needs to be in a bottle of formaldehyde a long time before we know you have the disease. Well, fortunately, these methodologies that we've used for years in medicine are now coming to behavioral issues, particularly as it relates to a medical disease that could end up with an alcohol problem. Now, what we do is, first of all, a third of the people in America don't drink. Another third of the people in America drink occasionally. I'm talking about a wedding or a celebration, or generally it's like less than once a month. And a third of the people are what we would consider social drinkers for the most part. And these are people that drink on a regular basis. So a third of the people do almost all the drinking in America. And this screening risk methodology focuses on people who are drinking socially and ask a simple question. And there's a fairly elaborate way to do this, but I like to focus on just the simple version, which says, with our one question, how many times in the past year have you had a 24-hour period of time where you've consumed 5 drinks or more? And that's for men, and it's 4 or more for women. So if a person answers that question honestly and their consumption of 5 drinks or more, and these are, we're not talking about a pitcher or keg here, we're talking about what is generally considered a legitimate quantity of alcohol considered a drink, and almost across the board, whether you're talking about a 4-ounce glass of wine, a 12-ounce beer, a jigger of scotch, there's about a half ounce of pure alcohol in any of these any of these beverages that are considered a drink. But if on one occasion in the past year, a person has had 5 or more drinks in a 24-hour period, 4 or more for women, that person is defined as a risky drinker.
I remember hearing in law school in my first year in an orientation session, they invited a trial lawyer and he mentioned that he did not drink 1 month before a trial, and that's how because he wanted to be that prepared. And I thought that made a lot of sense to me at the time. And now, being in recovery for a while, I realized that all those efforts on my part to control drinking were an indication that I had a problem, that people without a problem don't control it. And I look back and I look back to that talk that lawyer gave, and I wonder if, because that was my goal, and that was one thing that I did. I made sure that before a big hearing, before a big, if a case was going to trial, I would not drink, and I would not go out to places where I would be likely to drink. And I realized all that control was an indication of the problem, and yet I could not see it.
I originally came into the program thinking that my problem was depression. I did not connect my problems with my alcohol use. I had been drinking since I was in high school, felt like I was drinking as a social drinker, and that it wasn't really a problem for me. I had never lost a job as a result of my drinking. I had never gotten a DUI as a result of my drinking. Those kinds of things, and I had a job, I had a house, I had friends. Those kinds of things made me blind to the role that alcohol actually was playing in my problems. After being involved with the lawyer assistance program for a couple of years, and it occurred to me, it was not very dramatic, but it just occurred to me one day that maybe there was more to my alcohol use than I had previously thought. And that's when the fog kind of lifted, and I started seeing my relationship with alcohol for what it really was, and it was not a good one. And that's when I sought help from the Lawyers Assistance Program and the PALS component of the Lawyers Assistance Program specifically on direction and guidance to getting help with my alcoholism.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the intervention. So if a person passes the bar, the hurdle of drinking 5 drinks or more, 4 more for women in a 24-hour period in the past year equals some sort of intervention. There is no standard of what that intervention needs to be. And the way I've constructed this is when I can identify a person who is at risk, I will bring into the equation information, literature, a personal contact of anything that person would be willing to get involved with that would enlighten them more about the risk that they're accepting with their drinking pattern.
What I learned about the impact of alcoholism on my life was, after drinking for 40 years, from 65 to 05, I was the person in the worst position to evaluate whether it was having an impact on my life or not. I thought I was involved in a titanic struggle with some force, and what was happening to me was just bad luck. Well, in treatment I learned it wasn't. Everything that I thought was just a bolt from the blue was perfectly predictable because of my actions or inactions caused by drinking and several other difficulties I learned that I had in treatment. Or I learned that I had before treatment and was not treating appropriately by taking medications improperly and taking them with alcohol.
What the new science is beginning to show is that our brains aren't just empty vessels out there that need to be replaced with some chemical, but our brain is much more malleable than we ever thought. And this is what's so exciting to me, because I've known people who have recovered from alcohol and drug problems for decades, And literally, when you know someone who has recovered, you see that that person, the way I describe it, has become a different person in the same body. The brain has been transformed into a personality and a life, and even values and attitudes that are different than the person in active addiction held. That was not understood very much in medicine under this old concept of correcting chemical balances, because the chemical balances were basically the same then as they are now. This new concept in medicine, the word we use is called neuroplasticity. And what we realize is that these smallest molecules that we've been studying in the past actually come together to form a brain that is hugely adaptable to the world that we expose it to and live in. So as a person lives in a world of drugs and alcohol, that brain becomes better at surviving in that world of drugs and alcohol and unable to survive in a world without drugs and alcohol. So that's the negative part of the neuroplasticity. And the important thing that needs to happen that we used to not understand was that the brain can actually grow back around good living, productive life, abstinence, and health in a way that, even though very difficult at first, the natural state of that brain is to live in an abstinent way, free of alcohol and drugs, and losing the toxicity from these chemicals now allows the brain to fix itself, to heal, to mold, to become much more of a productive part of a person's life than ever thought. In other words, a person can achieve things that we never thought possible.
I was a heavy smoker when I quit drinking, and in sobriety I've quit smoking. Not that that's necessary, but I took up running, long distance running, and I've run a number of marathons. So I've gotten very healthy, and I always had a fear of heights, and so I wanted to get over. I wanted to challenge myself, and I went on a mountaineering course about 3 years ago and summited my first mountain out in the Cascades. And just the experience, I remember a friend said, I looked at a picture when I was halfway down from the summit on summit day, and she said, I've never seen you smile that big. And it was just, that was an experience I would have talked about but never have done. So my life has taken on a whole new meaning, and I've taken challenges that I would not have taken. I always had a fear of public speaking, and yet I challenged myself there, and I've taught night school at a local college and really got a lot of enjoyment out of it, got over my fear of speaking, and just the experience of being able to handle all these activities that I would have never dreamed of doing and would have only talked of doing.
The maintenance idea in chronic disease is really not a new one. It's been common knowledge in high blood pressure that you treat somebody for high blood pressure, and then when their blood pressure gets better, you don't stop the treatment. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But because somehow the mentality is different in the addiction field, and I think it's because we have a lot of guilt and shame and we want to move beyond it, and there may be other factors too. People say, I want to get my treatment behind me, I want to get on with life, and then when they feel better, they give up doing what worked to make them feel better. Now, part of that is what I call addictive thinking, which is not as much a part of diabetes and high blood pressure. But if you did something like that with high blood pressure, they'd call you an idiot. The blood pressure pills helps your blood pressure. Now, you need to stay in treatment. I don't know why that's such a difficult concept for people who have problems with alcohol and drug to adhere to, but it does happen. And now there's more of a conscious approach to monitoring, to planning. Most of the professional organizations that deal with people who have been in trouble, like the PALS program, the Doctors' Health and Effectiveness program, and some of these others, have realized that long-term monitoring, the FAA program too, have realized that long-term monitoring is a crucial part of success in recovery. And it's not in a punitive way, it's in a supportive way, because there are lots of things that come up in recovery that a person who's there might not be able to recognize and attend to, just like there are things in blood pressure that you've got to monitor it, because I don't care how smart you are, you cannot tell me what your blood pressure is. It has to be monitored. And now we're beginning to accept, even though a lot of people say it's a disease, addiction is disease, I've been amazed that people will say that in a heartbeat and not act like they believe it. So this whole monitoring idea is something that is part of the disease idea that now we're beginning to faithfully apply in the addiction world. If you had cancer, you would really want to be monitored for its return. And now we're beginning to see that just like any other disease, alcoholism and addiction need to be monitored if we expect to overcome the problem in a lifelong way.
Well, I'm sure if you lived in North Carolina or on the Eastern Seaboard during the late 90s, you read about me in the newspaper as a Superior Court judge who was arrested in Georgia and charged with possession of some controlled substances. As a result of that, I became a part of the Lawyer's Assistance Program as a client. In the sense that I agreed to have an assessment to determine whether or not I had any issues related to substance abuse, both drugs and alcohol. I suppose the two greatest joys of my recovery are that, one, I have reconciled with myself, that I'm not a bad person, that I really was sick and I sought help, and now I'm a better person as a result of it. And the second would be I have made significant progress in my relationship with others, particularly my children, my family, and my close friends.
As to whether the long-term use of some of the SSRIs are provide any benefit, I just don't think there's any science there yet. Theoretically, and this is all new with neuroplasticity, I think there is a huge potential for these drugs to be destructive in the process of recovery because of what we understand now. The brain must be challenged in order to fully develop in the recovery healing process. And if the person is no longer experiencing any of the dissonance of life through the use of drugs that take away and add good feelings, take away the bad feelings, the neuroplasticity capabilities of the brain may not ever kick in to the point where it allows that person full healing. When I go back and listen to the people who I think are the healthiest, strongest individuals that I know in my life today, almost all of those people had very difficult times in their life that they were required to rise to the challenge, and they did, and they learned from it, and they grew beyond that, and then helped the next guy come across the river instead of drowning. But if you look at the decade graphs of suicide fatalities, and you look at being able to measure Prozac in the water and all the people that are taking it, your common sense says if these drugs were so great, why don't we see fewer suicides? Why don't we see less depression? Why don't we see fewer childhood problems with mental? If ADD treatments work so well, if all the things we're doing that we hear so much good about from these drugs are working so well, why are we seeing climbing rates of bad outcomes from these diseases? Intuitively, a smart person would realize if all these therapies work so well, we should be seeing at least stable or improving outcomes. But it's just not. It just is not the case. There are a couple of effects of the SSRIs that are probably worth mentioning, and one relates to executive function, and I've got, and I want to hedge on the science for that, but in my experience, and now I can't speak from scientific studies, but one of the things, and I'll give you an example of a case, but the brain thinks differently when people are put, and that's the purpose of giving the drug. The purpose of giving the person antidepressant is so you look at life differently and hopefully with more hope and less depression. I remember a case that this happened, and that was actually the result the drug caused. A husband and wife, or the wife was concerned about depression. She was given an SSRI. The doctor, she followed up. The doctor got good reports. She was getting interested in building a career. She was very motivated she had more energy, was motivated to do things. The doctor continued to prescribe the drugs. And I happen to know this situation from a personal side. And even though from the medical side, with that doctor and the patient's relationship, it looked like a success, what happened during the treatment was this person who had been a good family member taking care of a couple of kids that a husband and wife had together, began to get less interested in the family, decided that she would move to a different city, she would pursue a career as a masseuse, and she fell in love with her instructor, felt like that open marriages were really not such a bad thing, just totally destroyed the family. And yet, if you ask that person, how are you doing, she was very happy with her life. But there was something going on in the thought process that was totally inconsistent with that personality and value system that had gotten her to the point in life where she had a stable family, a husband, a couple of kids, a job, and that sort of thing. That's what we call that's a change in executive function. Now, it's still, if she had been in a research project, it would have still looked like a success of an SSRI. But on the other hand, I watched a family destroyed by a treatment that we know now, verbal treatments and behavioral treatments and interventions can be just as effective.
So this is the story of Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller at Martha's Vineyard. Some of you may have heard this story before, possibly? No? Okay. All right, well, obviously very, very famous authors. Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five, Breakfast of Champions, Joseph Heller, Catch-22. They were at a hedge fund manager's home in Martha's Vineyard, back before the hedge fund managers were committing suicide, when they were extremely wealthy. And they were waiting to meet the hedge fund manager. And they have been friends for a long time. They were teasing each other. And Kurt Vonnegut, in teasing Joe, says, hey, you know, Joe, this guy, this hedge fund manager we're about to meet, he makes more in one day than you have made in your entire career selling the most important and most famous book you've ever written. In one day, putting him in his place. So Joe pauses for a while, and then he responds and he says, you know, I have something the hedge fund manager doesn't have. So, of course, Kurt's wondering what that could possibly be. He says, what is that? And Joe says, I have enough. So this is a disorder of not having enough. And that's what's going on in the brains. But I wanted to set the context for the talk by saying that this is a spiritual malady, and it's also a brain disease, and it's a disorder of reward, and it's a disorder of enough. And for those of us who have it, that switch just never flips. So that kind of set they are. No talk on depression and alcoholism would be complete without talking about suicide, because it's a huge risk. Both depression and alcohol dependence are enormous risk factors for suicide. And so we need to touch on that. A little bit on what's going on in the brain of people who have depression. What exactly is happening there? We'll talk a little bit about the prevalence, some of the trouble that we have figuring out which alcoholics and addicts have depression and which don't, who's just got the blues, who's just a dry drunk, who has true depression. How do we figure that out? When do we figure that out? So I want to talk to you a little bit about that. What are the barriers to recovery? What if you do have dual diagnosis, which is depression and addiction or depression and alcoholism? What if you have both? What are the things that get in the way of your getting well? And I think finish off with, well, what can be done to help you get through that if you are somebody who falls in that category? Okay, so what do we really know? What do we really know from science about treating people who have depression and alcoholism? Not much, unfortunately. I'm going to just tell you for a fact that recovering alcoholics are not where the dollars go to study, right? There's a sliver of people who are in recovery, a very small number of people. The larger population is not in recovery. They have active alcoholism. And that's where most of the research goes. So there's very little research on what to do about a sober alcoholic who has depression. Very, very little. Now, this is a meta-analysis, and the largest one that was ever done. They looked at 300 trials over a 30-year period of time. Only 44 of those trials were placebo-controlled, which in medicine is very important to do a placebo-controlled study. Only 14 of those were randomized, right? And it turns out when you do research that randomization is extremely important for good study design. 8 of those studies focused on alcohol, and in 4 of them, people were drinking at the time of the study, right? So what are you left with? The only clear findings I could find from any of those 4 studies was that antidepressants work better if you're sober. Well, congratulations, you spent all this money to study this, and you figured out that Prozac works less efficiently if you're drinking. You know, there's your tax dollars at work. So in the ensuing year, in the years since, that we haven't really acquired much more, unfortunately. And rather than delve into that, I will just let you know the key takeaways. The key takeaways are, yes, of course, the medicines don't work as well. Most of the studies that look at the incidence of dual diagnosis and alcoholism fail to exclude people who are actively using. So they really, there are very few studies that have actually looked at sobriety and alcohol and depression. Let's see. Let's talk about depressive disorders. A lot of people will say that, I'm depressed. Well, what does that mean? What does that really mean? You know, depressed mood is a symptom. It's not an illness. And in medicine, we work very hard to make the distinction between a symptom and a disorder. Because really, you want to treat the disorder, alleviate the symptom if you need to, but you really want to get down to causes and conditions. And there are several different disorders. A lot of people will tell you, oh yeah, I was depressed too, but I just pulled myself up from my bootstraps and I was fine. Why don't you do the same thing? And the problem there is a confusion of the illness of depression with the symptom of depressed mood. Everybody has experienced the symptom of depressed mood. When you come into rehab, you're generally either depressed or intoxicated. Right? So let me just tell you, and there are exceptions, by the way, but just generally speaking, everybody with alcoholism is going to experience depressed mood. I mean, it's fairly universal. I actually have a slide and some data on that coming up. So, but these are disorders like major depressive disorder. You've probably heard it called clinical depression. Dysthymia, which is a chronic state of depressed mood, sort of a sense of the blues over a long period of time. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression, same condition. A lot of controversy about making the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So just an important point there. When you're diagnosing depression, when I'm diagnosing depression, it's important that I pay attention to the fact that not everybody with depression feels depressed. This is very, very common in my line of work, where I treat a lot of physicians, attorneys, and others. They have something that, as psychiatrists, we call it isolation of affect, but it's basically a mask, that people can't get in touch with their own feelings. So they'll often come in with a mask, smiling, happy, oh, not a problem in the world, like the big book's boy whistling in the dark, if you will.
And it made me feel isolated, and it made me feel misunderstood to a near terminal point. It was really awful. It was really lonely inside. And I presented as, I thought I was the happiest guy in the world. But I wasn't. And that's part of the self-delusion that I went through. And that was another thing I discovered in treatment, to shed some of the self-delusion. I can still fool myself rather handily, but it's not as bad as it used to be because it was awful.
We get a lot of whistling in the dark when people come in, that things are okay. People can't get in touch with their emotions. You can make the diagnosis of depression without the person experiencing depressed mood. All right, it's just one of the symptoms. There are many others. You can read them up here on the slide. In third world countries, people tend to somatize the illness. So if you go to Pakistan or India or somewhere else, you won't generally have people showing up at their doctor saying that they feel sad. Instead, you'll see people with abdominal, stomach complaints, physical complaints, pains, aches, sleep, etc. Same condition, same disorder, different phenotype is what we call it, different presentation. I went to a conference once where there was an Indian doctor in the back, and he heard someone say something just like what I just told you. And he stood up and he said, no, you Westerners have it all wrong. It's you all who psychologize this illness. This is actually a biological disorder, and you guys live too far above the neck for too long. You aren't in touch with your bodies, and as a result, you tend to, psychologize this very biological illness. So cultural perspective, very important. Okay. When we make the diagnosis of depression, we got to rule out all the other stuff that could be included, including any kind of medical conditions or bereavement. We don't treat grief with a pill. Grief takes time and work, right? So we don't prescribe antidepressants for grief, which is bereavement. Did alcoholism cause your mood problem? We're going to get deeper into that later. And then there are many medical illnesses that can cause you to feel depressed. I list thyroid because it's the most common one. It's the one that's known in the common parlance. But there are many other conditions. And we make sure that there's never been an episode of mania. Because if there has, ever, then we diagnose bipolar disorder, not depression. Why does that matter? The treatments are completely different. The treatments are completely different. So that's important to know. What is bipolar disorder? You probably have heard about people running down the street naked, in the middle of the night. Yes, that happens sometimes. I do see those patients. I saw a lot more of those when I was working in Charlotte. Far fewer of them end up at Farley, but certainly it does happen. Elevated, expansive mood. Remember that the bipolar patient doesn't have to be high or excited. The bipolar patient can be irritable, and that's possible, so that's important to know. They don't need to sleep as much. Their ideas are racing all over the place. They're very distractible. A lot of people think if you're distractible, it means ADD. If you can't concentrate, it means you have attention deficit disorder. The reality is the vast majority of people who can't concentrate, who are alcoholics, either have post-acute withdrawal syndrome, because look, if you've been poisoning your brain with alcohol for a few decades and then show up 2 days into rehab and expect to be able to read War and Peace, that's irrational, right? So it very much can be. It can also be depression. Depression's a very common cause of impaired concentration. It can be bipolar disorder. And I would say in a minority of cases it can be ADD. But ADD is way overdiagnosed. And I can tell you about ADD later during the break if anybody wants to know. So, okay. A lot of medical conditions can cause depression. This is just a list of them, and it's a partial list. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Let's talk about suicide. Because no talk about depression and alcoholism is complete without suicide. Suicidologists, and I'm not one, but they tell me that this is a preventable disease, preventable disorder. And they believe that it has biological markers that they're trying to find out. And they look at completed suicides and attempted suicides, and they see differences in the spinal fluid of some chemicals. And so there is something really biological about suicide, for sure. Many, if not most of the people who successfully complete suicide have alcohol in their bloodstream at the time of death. So it's very, very common to have that going on. Oh, and I should point out that you're 20 times more likely to complete suicide if you're an alcoholic than if you're not. Now, in medicine, 20 times is huge. It's huge in terms of a risk factor, right? In medicine, we freak out when a risk factor is 1.5 times. We're talking about 20 times, so it's massive kind of risk factor. What are the risk factors for suicide? We look at previous suicide attempts, obviously, a history of any kind of mental illness. I told you alcoholism and drug addiction, big risk factor for suicide. Family history of suicide, it can run in families, and we do see that. If you were mistreated as a child, having feelings of hopelessness. If you tend to be aggressive, you're more likely to complete suicide. If you can't get help, and if you've had some major catastrophic loss, obviously, that's a risk factor. Any kind of physical illness is also a risk factor. If you have easy access to any kind of lethal methods, that's also a risk factor. If you have some cultural and religious beliefs, for example, we've known for a long time that Protestants kill themselves much more often than Catholics, much, much more. And so that's been known for a long time. And there are other kinds of cultural things. In some cultures, it's a noble resolution of conflict. You'll sometimes hear about Japanese businessmen who have let the company down and complete suicide and such. So there are cultural factors as well. A sense of isolation. We do see epidemics of suicide as well. What are the things that protect you? Getting access to care, getting help, having a family support and a community kind of support, having some skills in dealing with the problems in your life. Skills that, by the way, for many of these people, there was no reason that they would have acquired at any point. So they have to learn them. By the way, you can learn those skills in AA. And that's, we see that. And cultural and religious beliefs as well can make a difference. Let me briefly, and again, this is kind of the dense part of the talk, let me open up the brain a little bit and tell you what's going on inside the brain of people who are suffering from depression. Now, if you watch enough primetime television and you see the ads for antidepressants, you would become convinced that depression is nothing more than a chemical imbalance. And if you crack your brain open with a ball-peen hammer, there'll be two little beakers inside, one with serotonin and one with norepinephrine. And if you just fill them up enough, you won't be depressed anymore, right? It's been a very useful hypothesis, because in the end, primary care doctors and others who have 10, maybe 15 minutes to talk to you at most need to be able to give you a clear-cut, concise explanation of what's going on for you, give you some medication if you need it, and try to destigmatize it. So it's easy to say, well, it's just a chemical imbalance in your brain. You just need more medicine, you'll be fine, right? That's a nice kind of, oh, well, Mr. Jones, we need to tune up your diabetes medication, and, well, how's that gout going? Let's adjust your allopurinol. Oh, and by the way, I think you have a chemical imbalance. I talked to your wife, and here's some Prozac. And that's kind of how it was done. And so in the pop culture, it became understood as a chemical imbalance. But depression is so much more than a chemical imbalance. And I want to tell you about what's happening in the brain. So there are these circuits, and I apologize for the visibility of this slide, but there are these circuits in your brain. And they are in this little box here called mood regulatory circuits. Let me just turn this thing on. So that's in here. This is your brain, okay? Now there's things that render you vulnerable to having a depressive episode. That might be your gender. Women are more likely to develop depression. A family history of depression, certain gene polymorphisms, prenatal insults, temperament, etc. That renders you more vulnerable to developing depression. Then there are some exogenous stressors, some factors like trauma, abuse, life events, and other medical illnesses that also put a stress on your brain, these mood regulatory circuits. And if these circuits cannot stave off and maintain this homeostasis, then you end up in a depressive episode. This is the most likely, most plausible explanation for what's going on with depression. So what we want to do, we want to take this mood regulatory circuit box and open it up, and what we will find inside is that it's not simply a beaker with serotonin and norepinephrine, but something much more complex going on in the brain to help you develop some resilience against a major depressive episode. Do I have everybody there? Okay, good. Okay, so in this hypothesis, there's a network of circuits that regulate a variety of key brain functions that help maintain you and your function, help maintain your mood, your concentration, your autonomic system, etc., all of the things that are involved in depression. They regulate affect, which is mood, cognitive process, your psychomotor activities, circadian rhythm, all the things that are involved in depression, in clinical depression. These circuits do that. So let's look inside. So I've opened up that box now, and instead of finding a couple of beakers, what we found is a bunch of different brain regions that are connected. Each of these little things like MF9/10, median forebrain bundle or whatever, RCG, it's an area next to the central gyrus, the parahippocampus, hippocampal area, thalamus. These are all sort of accepted abbreviations for little regions in your brain. And these regions are involved in different aspects of depression. This area here is involved in the cognitive side of depression. Remember, depression has cognitive symptoms, trouble concentrating, negative thoughts, etc. These regions of the brain are involved in your mood state. Do you feel depressed? Do you feel down? These regions are involved in salience, integrating your thoughts and your feelings, which is, it turns out, it's very important in people. There's a disconnect often between thoughts and feelings of people who have depression. And then these are involved in more of the autonomic or physical signs of depression. Have you ever seen someone with depression looks like they're walking through molasses, right? That's being regulated by these regions of the brain, deeper brainstem areas. So all of these different regions are at work. Some of them involve serotonin, some involve norepinephrine, some of them involve neither. Glutamate, GABA, other neurotransmitters. They're connected to each other. Some of these areas have diffuse projections to various parts of the brain. So there's a very complicated network of various circuits that are involved. And thinking, by the way, can change these. And action can change these. We're going to talk about that later. But you can change your brain through action. You can change your brain through thinking. And that's important. Medicine isn't the only way to change your brain, although you may have reached a stage where that is necessary. So I'm sorry you can't see this too well, but that says cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a type of psychotherapy, may involve these regions of the brain. We know that because when you take functional pictures of people's brains and you give them this kind of therapy, their brain changes as a result of that therapy. Notice that that's cognitive behavioral therapy. In other words, it's therapy where they get you to do stuff, take action, right? Then there's deep brain stimulation, ECT, et cetera, that can affect these regions of the brain, and medications can affect these different regions. So this is a gross oversimplification, but I'll just give you a sense of the fact that whether you use therapy or medications or whatever approach you use, recognize that it's not going to solve the entire problem. No single approach is really going to solve the entire problem because the problem is too complex. It is not as simple as replenishing a chemical.
When I decided to take advice from people and to become involved in the process of recovery, I lost an anger that I had carried for 28 years. I lost resentments that when I wrote them down and read them out to my therapeutic group in treatment were so petty. I was embarrassed to read them, and I had held on to them for so long. If I could give an example, I returned in 1968 on my destroyer from my first cruise to Vietnam. I was the first lieutenant in charge of the deck force. I carried a knife because at sea, around lines, a knife's a lifesaver, and I'd cut myself out of 5 or 6 lines on the cruise on replenishment stations. Within 3 minutes of coming ashore, I wasn't even ashore, of tying up, I was in a rage about somebody asking me why I was the only officer with a knife. And I carried that resentment for 38 years, and in every argument I had with that person, I brought it up. And it meant so much to me that it was disproportionately important. I got everything backwards. Everybody I thought was my friend was just somebody I drank with. Everybody who was trying to help me, who was my friend, I thought was trying to control me and was resentful. I truly spent about 25 years looking out at the wrong end of the telescope and making every decision based on that flawed analysis. And that was a direct cause of the alcohol and the other conditions that I was dealing with and did not realize. And that's part of the deception. Now, everybody else around me knew it. I was the last one to know. It's like I say about mental illness. One, it's an upwardly mobile disease. Nobody loses their mind and becomes the garbage man. And second, the person that loses their mind is the last one to know. That's what makes it so wonderful, and that's what makes it so terrible. And that's what happened to me.
Okay, so we know that mood instability and depression are among the most common symptoms that people report when they walk into rehab. I've told you that. People with substance use disorders who don't experience mood symptoms are in the minority, right? That's the guy we do the drug screen on. Depressed mood is almost universal in early recovery, especially during detox, and post-acute withdrawal, right? People have heard of post-acute withdrawal? Let me just take a minute, because I don't know if everybody has. So post-acute withdrawal is problems with mood and concentration that occur for the first several months of early recovery. Doesn't mean you have depression or anything else. These are the brain healing, if you will, responding to what are semi-permanent changes that have occurred as a result of the development of addiction and chronic exposure to intoxicants. And it lasts different periods of time. Sometimes people who've taken Xanax or Klonopin will tell you they weren't able to concentrate right for 2 years. But then they are. Sometimes, generally what we see is several months, though. Maybe a year, some cases 2. But there really is a distinct syndrome, post-acute withdrawal syndrome, that's characterized by trouble concentrating, trouble focusing, mood problems, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so, and that's post-acute withdrawal syndrome. Okay. So, and by the way, that overlap of post-acute withdrawal and depression is the reason why nobody can seem to figure out how many people with alcoholism actually have depression and how many don't. So a lot of times you try to say, well, which came first, right? Were you depressed before you started drinking? And that can be helpful. You know, if someone had a real full-on depressive disorder at age 9, you know, that can be really helpful in terms of making the diagnosis. That's very useful information. We always try to talk to family. You know, where I work, we always talk to the family if they give the release. We always try to find out what the childhood is like. We always try to talk to as many people as possible to get a feel for what this person was like, right? Part of the problem is that so many of the folks we see started drinking at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 before the usual onset of depression. So many of these people were using long before they would have developed a depressive disorder. So which came first won't always help you. But it is helpful to know, and sometimes it can help you. Does that make sense? Try to find out which came first, but sometimes people start drinking so early that it's hard to kind of figure that out. The other problem is that you could look and say, well, what were you like when you were sober, Mr. Jones, 4 years ago? Were you depressed during that period of sobriety? Well, now I'm going to share a secret with you. It turns out that sometimes people with alcoholism and drug addiction lie. I know. I know. It shocked me too, but it's true. So, and then the other thing that happens with those periods of sobriety is that people don't often remember or accurately report them. Or they may think of themselves as having been sober, but really they were dry. Or they may think of themselves as having been sober and not realize that their doctor was prescribing Vicodin for them, and that doesn't count if they're overtaking that, or their brain is being exposed to something. It's very, very difficult to clarify those periods of abstinence and point to them and say, well, Mr. Jones was depressed during those 4 months that he was sober, okay, quote unquote sober. So let's just be aware of that. Oh, and sometimes you're exposed to things you didn't think were a problem, like Sonata, Lunesta, Ambien, whatever. These things that we know are intoxicants, and you're being exposed to them, and you figure, well, I'm still sober. And without getting into the seething cauldron of debate there, I can tell you that I've personally treated people whose lives have been destroyed by Ambien addiction, pure Ambien addiction and nothing else. So these are intoxicants. They are addictive. Just be aware of that. Okay. It's a lot easier to diagnose mania, by the way, because mania is generally very frank, unambiguous, and if it occurs, more than a few days after, generally we say after a week or two, if you're manic, that's it. We're going to treat it. Because post-acute withdrawal, early sobriety, these things don't generally produce mania. So if your drug screens are negative, if you're really not using and you're manic, we generally would treat it. We'd just treat it because it's too difficult to stay sober when you're manic. It's impossible. It's very, very big risk factor there. So what's a clinician to do? What I do is I hedge my bets. Now this is where you're going to get 1,000 different answers. But I'm going to tell you what my answer is. And it's an answer that I believe has worked very, very well. And that is, you hedge your bets. You recognize that there are going to be some folks that have depression that you're not going to treat. But you do your best to stay close to those people if you're worried that maybe they have depression. You get to know them and you spend time with them and you stay close to them over time. You keep a close eye on them and you watch for the symptoms beyond the 3-month period, 4, 5, 6. You make sure that they get to good people who are taking care of them. And you treat some people that otherwise you might go to other places and say, well, they don't have depression. They don't meet the DSM-4 criteria for depression. Those criteria that I told you didn't include you. Right? So you've got to be willing to say, maybe this person doesn't have 5 out of 9 criteria for depression, maybe they have 4. Where do we get this 5 out of 9 criteria from? We got those criteria from a normative distribution of symptoms and a decision to draw a line to cut off 2 standard deviations. Well, I mean, anybody who knows about statistics will tell you that when you draw that line to cut off 2 standard deviations, you leave some people in the tail. And those people could be us. So that's important. So we hedge our bets. Cognitive behavioral therapy is frequently used, and it's a wonderful type of therapy for depression. You can sort of do it on yourself if you're not too depressed. You just get this book called Feeling Good by David Burns, read it and do the exercises. It's a phenomenal approach to managing depression. Most psychiatry residents will tell you that the way they learn to do cognitive behavioral therapy is by getting 1 or 2 of these books and staying a couple chapters ahead of their patients. I can tell you that's how I first learned to do it. So, basically the bottom line is that it really is something you can learn. So these are great.
Over the years, we've had the opportunity to work with various entities of service to lawyers, the various psychiatrists, psychologists, and treatment facilities. We have worked with them very intimately, and we know who best to refer lawyers to who are presenting with various problems, be it depression, bipolar disorder, alcoholism, and other addiction diseases. It's been our experience over time to work with the programs who are most successful, the individual professionals who are most successful in recognizing and dealing with lawyers specifically.
I think the lawyer support group we offer are wonderful because they allow lawyers to come together and support each other. It helps them to understand that they are not alone on their journey to recovery, that there are other lawyers out there who had traveled that path and who are willing to share their experience and their hope and their support and their love. And I think that's wonderful that the support group offers that. You are not alone. We are here for you. We're here to support you. We are here to assist you in any way you will allow us to, because we want them to become healthy. We want them to become productive as lawyers, and we want them to deal with the issues related to the substance abuse or the mental health related concerns with our support.
Every lawyer who comes into the offices of the Lawyer Assistance Program has hoped that his road to success would be straight ahead. But we all find that there are twists and turns and often a few potholes. And one thing that the lawyer gets from the Lawyer Assistance Program is some skills that he didn't learn in law school, that you get out of the potholes in a different way than you got into them. And the Lawyer Assistance Program brings really three important things to each lawyer, and that is great resources to help learn these new skills, great support by all the peers and over 200 volunteers who we have helping other lawyers, and most important is confidentiality, which the state bar rules provide for each lawyer who accesses the program, so that any conversations with me or Ed Ward or Tawanda Gardner are confidential. And not only that, any conversation with another volunteer, a PALS volunteer or a friend's volunteer, they are also protected by the attorney-client privilege. So we welcome each lawyer who seeks help and comes to get that kind of confidential assistance.
They say you don't know what you don't know, and I didn't know what it was like to go through life any other way from the way I had always tried to manage. And to learn that there was another option, and then once I got in it, to find out how much better it was. It totally changed my attitude about my job and about practicing law. I had been very unhappy doing that, and now I feel very fulfilled as a lawyer and enjoy the profession very much. I had difficulty in dealing with people in my life, personal relationships. It has taught me things about how to more effectively deal with those kinds of personal issues when they come up. So it's opened up a whole new way of living for me that I just didn't realize was possible. That sounds kind of pie in the sky, but it's really the truth.
My name is Bonnie Wire, and I'm president of the North Carolina State Bar. This video was produced for you by the North Carolina Lawyers Assistance Program. This is a vital program that is available to every lawyer in North Carolina. It provides assistance on any issue which may impair an attorney's ability to practice law. The Lawyers Assistance Program, or LAP, has been tremendously successful and has helped literally hundreds of attorneys in this state. And it is a totally confidential process. The purpose of this video is to help you be aware of how we as lawyers are affected by emotional distress, by depression, by substance abuse, so that you'll be better able to find confidential help as the need arises for either yourself or for a colleague. Thank you so much for participating in this program.